Welcome, Egg Deep Divers. Today we're taking a deep dive, like really deep, into connectionism.
It's a topic that's been making waves in cognitive science and philosophy.
Exactly. We're talking artificial neural networks. Can they really explain how our minds work?
And what are the philosophical questions they raise?
To guide us, we've got some awesome selections from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's article on connectionism,
So buckle up. This is going to be a fascinating ride.
especially for our philosophical listeners out there, right?
Absolutely. Connectionism, it touches on so many big philosophical questions.
Like the nature of thought, how we represent knowledge, even consciousness.
Yeah, all that juicy stuff.
Okay, so first things first, let's define our terms. What exactly is connectionism? Why all the buzz?
Well, you can think of connectionism as this movement in cognitive science
Okay.
that tries to model the mind, how it works, using these things called artificial neural networks.
Artificial neural networks.
ANs for short.
AN's got it.
And these networks, they're inspired by the structure of the brain.
So like a computer model of the brain.
Kind of, but instead of actual neurons, you have these interconnected units.
Units.
Yeah, think of them like simplified neurons, and the strength of the connections between them that's represented by weights.
Weights. Okay, I think I'm following so far.
Good.
So instead of seeing the mind as a traditional computer running lines of code,
Right.
connectionism says it's more like this web of interconnected units, always adapting and learning.
Exactly. It's a pretty different way of thinking about it compared to that classical view.
Oh, totally. A huge shift. So the classical view, remind me, who are the big names there again?
Oh, well, you've got Fodor Piloshin.
Right, right.
They see the mind as this symbol processor.
A symbol processing.
It's manipulating abstract symbols according to rules, like a computer program, basically.
Okay.
But connectionism, it says, nope, not so fast. It offers this non-symbolic approach, where information is distributed across the entire network.
Distributed. Interesting.
Yeah, encoded in those patterns of activation and the weights between the units.
Okay, now that's where it gets really mind-bending for a philosopher.
Right.
Challenges how we think about representation and information processing at a fundamental level.
It does.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty of these neural networks. You mentioned input, output, and hidden units. Walk me through those.
All right. Imagine a simplified nervous system.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Sensory neurons, right? They take in input from the outside world.
Our senses.
Exactly. Those are like the input units in an ANN. Then you've got motor neurons. They generate actions that are like the output units.
So input is like what we perceive, and output is how we react.
You got it.
But what about all those other neurons in between, the one that are doing the thinking, so to speak?
Those are like the hidden units in the network.
Hidden units. So that's where the real magic happens.
You could say that. The key is in the weights between those units.
The weights.
Those determine how the network responds to any given input. Like, think of them as knobs that get adjusted as the network learns.
Knobs. Interesting analogy.
So, finding the right knob settings for all those connections, that's the real challenge.
the learning process.
Exactly. That's where learning algorithms come in to figure out how to tweak those weights based on what the network experiences.
The article mentions two main types, supervised and unsupervised learning. What's the difference, and which one is more like how we learn, as humans?
Supervised learning, it's like teaching with flashcards.
Flashcards.
You give the network labeled examples, say pictures of cats and dogs, and you tell it which is which.
Labeling them.
Right. So the network adjusts its weights to try to match its output to those labels.
So it's basically being told what's right and wrong,
Exactly, like getting feedback on a test.
and then studying to do better next time. Okay, that makes sense. What about unsupervised learning?
That's more like letting a kid loose in a room full of toys and letting them figure things out on their own.
Ooh, I like that.
You don't give any explicit labels, but the network still learns to categorize stuff. It picks up on patterns and similarities.
So like a kid learning colors without anyone telling them the name.
Exactly.
That seems way more analogous to how we learn, right?
It does, doesn't it? And that actually highlights a challenge for current ANs. They often need a ton of labeled data for that supervised learning to work well.
Right.
But humans, even little kids, can learn complex things from just a handful of examples, sometimes even just one.
Yeah, that's true. We're pretty good at that.
It's this one-shot learning thing. Current ANNs, they struggle with that.
So they're still playing catch-up in some ways.
They are, but they can already do some pretty incredible things.
Oh, totally. The article mentioned some early experiments that really blew my mind. Like NetTalk, the network that learned to read aloud.
NetTalk, that was a game changer. It really showed what connectionist models were capable of.
So what happened? How did it learn?
Well, at first, its output was just noise, like random sounds. But as they trained it on English text,
English
it
texts.
gradually started to sound like babbling.
Babbling, wow.
Then it got closer and closer to actual English words.
Amazing.
Yeah, and eventually it could pronounce words with surprising accuracy.
So it wasn't just memorizing words, it was actually picking up on the rules of pronunciation, like the patterns in how we speak.
Right, like the phonology of English. It was extracting those patterns from the data it was trained on. And that's how connectionists think the human brain learns language, too.
It challenges that classical view, right? That language needs innate symbolic rules to be learned.
Big time.
But here's a philosophical curveball. Does simply mimicking speech mean that net talk actually understood what it was saying? Like, what would a connectionist say about that?
Ooh, good question. That gets to the heart of some huge debates in connectionism.
About?
The nature of representation and meaning, we'll definitely have to dig into those later on.
Okay, consider me hooked. What other cool experiments did they highlight in the article?
Well, there was this one where a network learned to predict the past tense of English verbs.
Past tense of English verbs. It sounds simple enough.
Except when you remember all those irregular
Ugh,
verbs.
right. English could be such a mess sometimes. I still trip up on those.
I know. So this network, it had to learn both the regular verbs, the ones that follow the rules.
Add ed, easy peasy.
Exactly, and those darn irregular verbs, like go becomes went. It's all over the place.
No logic to it.
Right. And what's really wild is that the network didn't just memorize the past tense forms, it actually made the same over-regularization errors that kids do when they're learning language.
Wait, so it was making the same mistakes as a human child?
Yep, like saying goed instead of went.
Exactly. I remember my niece doing that. It's so cute, but also kind of fascinating.
It is. It's a thing you see in kids where they apply a grammatical rule, like adding ed for past tense, but they over-apply it to verbs that don't follow the rule.
Because they haven't quite grasped the exceptions yet?
Exactly, and the fact that a neural network, just trained on verb forms, did the same thing, that's some pretty compelling evidence that it might be learning language in a way similar to how humans do.
Okay, that is seriously mind-blowing.
Right.
It suggests these networks are doing more than just simple pattern matching. Maybe they're tapping into something deeper about how our brains learn and represent a language.
Could be.
But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, I know there's one more experiment mentioned in the article, the one that tackles the even trickier issue of grammatical structure.
Ah, yes. That one used a recurrent neural network.
Recurrent.
It has feedback loops, unlike those feed-forward networks where activation just flows in one direction.
Right, right.
Those loops, they let recurrent networks process sequences over time. Perfect for language.
So it's like a network with a memory, right? It can keep track of the context of a sentence as it goes along.
You got it. And in this experiment, the network was trained to predict the next word in a sentence.
Predict the next word. Interesting.
And after training, it could actually do it. It could successfully predict the next word based on the preceding words, even for sentences it had never seen before.
So it wasn't just memorizing sentences, it was understanding the grammar, like how words relate to each other in a sentence.
That's the connectionist interpretation, at least. It's as if the network learned the underlying rules of grammar, not from explicit programming, but just by being exposed to a bunch of language data.
That's a pretty big challenge to the classical view of the mind, right? Where language is all about manipulating those abstract symbols based on predefined rules.
It is, though of course there are some weaknesses and limitations to this approach too.
Right, right. Always got to look at both sides.
We don't want to get too deep into the philosophical weeds before we explore those limitations.
Agreed. But so far, I'm pretty impressed. We've learned what connectionism is, how neural networks function, and we've seen some incredible examples of what they can do.
Learning to read aloud, predicting verb tenses, even getting a grasp of grammar.
It's a pretty convincing case for a whole new way of looking at the mind.
And for a philosopher, it opens a whole new world of questions about how we think, represent knowledge, and the relationship between our minds and the world out there.
Exactly. But we'll have to save those juicy philosophical questions for next time.
Stay tuned, folks.
Until then, keep those neurons firing, deep divers. Welcome back to the deep dive. Last time, things were getting pretty wild, right?
Yeah, we were exploring the exciting world of connectionism, all those amazing things those artificial neural networks can do.
Right. But as with anything, like any promising approach, there are always limitations.
That's true. Connectionist models, they're intriguing, but they don't have all the answers yet.
Right. So we need to consider those weaknesses, like before we get too carried away with the possibilities.
Exactly.
So let's unpack those then. Where do these connectionist models, where do they fall short?
Well, one of the biggest criticisms is that current models, they're often too simple.
Too simple.
Yeah, compared to the real brain, like the brain is so complex.
I see. So they're leaving out a lot of important details.
Exactly. For example, most models, they don't take into account different types of neurons.
Okay.
Or the roles of neurotransmitters.
Oh, right, right.
Or even the way neurons are connected and how they actually communicate.
So they're more like simplified versions of the brain? capturing the basic idea but missing a lot of the nuance.
That's a good way to put it. And this leads to another criticism, actually. The learning algorithms,
The algorithms.
particularly backpropagation.
Oh, backpropagation,
It
yeah.
might not be biologically plausible.
We talked about how it needs a tons of labeled examples to work, which isn't really how humans learn.
Yeah, humans and animals, we can often learn from just a few examples, or even just one. This one-shot learning thing.
Right, one-shot
For
learning.
an ANs, they really struggle with that.
Makes you wonder if there are other learning mechanisms in the brain, right? Something we haven't discovered yet.
That's a huge area of research right now, and there's another challenge for connectionism, explaining those higher-level cognitive functions,
Like what?
like abstract reasoning, planning, problem solving, the stuff we associate with, thinking.
Right, the big philosophical questions.
Exactly. Connectedness models, they're great at pattern recognition, learning associations, even some parts of language. But
But
but it's not clear how they can handle those more deliberate, rule-based processes.
So are connections saying that maybe those rule-based processes aren't that important? Or that they could be, like, boiled down to patterns of activation in a network?
Those are some of the key debates within connectionism. Some argue for what's called implementational connectionism.
Implementational connection.
Yeah, they're trying to show that even symbolic processing, it can be done with neural networks. But then you've got the radical connectionists.
Radical connection,
It's they forget symbols. They think all cognition, everything, can be explained through the way networks work, just connections and activations.
Wow, that is radical. It's like a whole philosophical battleground.
It is.
And I know there's one particular battle that gets everyone fired up. Connectionism versus that classical symbolic view of the mind.
Oh, yeah.
We touched on it before, but I think it's worth, like, really digging into this clash of paradigm. What are the main points of contention?
The biggest disagreement is how each view sees representation,
Representation.
how information is stored and processed in the mind. Classicists, they believe in symbolic representation, remember.
They see the mind like a computer program, working with abstract symbols.
Exactly, but connectionists, they go for distributed representation, where information is encoded in the patterns of activation across the whole network, not just in individual units.
So instead of having, like, a cat neuron,
Right.
the concept of cat would be a specific pattern of activation across lots of units.
Precisely. And that distributed representation, it has some interesting consequences. For one, it's very robust. Yeah, like if some units get damaged, the network can keep going. Maybe not quite as well, but it still works.
Kind of like how the brain can sometimes recover from damage, right? Like after a stroke.
Exactly. It's called graceful degradation. Very different from what happens if a traditional computer loses a key component. Then it just crashes.
Total system failure.
Right.
Makes sense. It's a much more biologically plausible way to think about information in the brain.
It is. And distributed representation, it also gives us a new way to think about meaning. It's different from the classical view.
How so?
Well, in a connectionist model, the meaning of a concept, it's kind of embedded in the relationships between its activation pattern and the activation patterns of other concepts.
Okay, I think I get it. So the meaning of cat isn't just in a single unit. It's in how its activation connects to, like, fur, whiskers, meals, and all that.
Exactly. It's the whole web of associations. And that leads to some really cool philosophical questions.
Like what?
Well, for example, it challenges that language of thought hypothesis.
The language of thought.
The idea that our thoughts are structured like sentences with symbols for concepts and logical operators connecting them.
Because if meaning is distributed across a network, how would those symbols even be formed or processed?
Right. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, our thoughts aren't as neat and organized as that language of thought would have us believe.
Fascinating.
Maybe they're more like these messy, overlapping patterns. And the meaning, it comes from the relationships between those concepts, not from individual symbols.
That's a pretty huge shift from traditional views.
It is.
And I know there's another big debate sparked by connectionism.
Oh, yeah.
The systematicity debate.
Ah, yes, systematicity. That one's all about the structure of thought, really gets to the core of it.
So remind me what systematicity is again.
It's the idea that our cognitive abilities are all interconnected. There's a structure to them.
Like, if I can understand the cat sat on the mat, I can also understand the mat sat on the cat, even though it doesn't make sense, right?
Exactly. It's about how we combine concepts and grammatical structures. And classicists, they say this systematicity, it's best explained by symbolic processing. If you have symbols for cat, mat, sat on, you can mix and match them.
Using rules.
Yep, to create different meanings.
But can connectionist models, with those distributed representations and weighted connections, Can they really account for this?
That is the question. $1 million question, actually. It's been a huge point of contention between connectionists and classicists.
So what do the classicists say?
Well, Fodor and Pyloshin, big names in the classical camp,
Right, right.
they argued that any systematicity a connectionist model shows, it's just an accident,
An accident.
a byproduct of training, not an actual feature of the architecture itself.
So they're saying connectionist networks can maybe imitate systematicity,
Mimic it, yeah.
but they don't really explain it, because there's no guarantee that a network will generalize its knowledge systematically.
That's the argument. But connectionists, they've pushed back, of course. They say Fodor and Pyloshin's criteria for systematicity are way too strict.
Too strict how?
Well, they argue those criteria would even rule out the human brain.
Which is, of course, a neural network itself.
Exactly. Plus, they point out that you can build classical models that aren't systematic.
Right, it's not like symbols automatically equal systematicity.
Right. So the debate, it's more nuanced than it might seem at first. It's not just about connectionism versus classicism. It's about how we define and measure systematicity in the first place.
So it's more complicated than it looks on the surface.
Way more. And this has actually led to a more refined view of the whole debate.
Refined how?
The focus now is on different levels of systematicity.
Oh, levels. Okay, I'm interested. What are those levels?
One way to think about it is how well does a model generalize what it knows to new situations?
Generalization. Okay.
The weakest form of systematicity, that's just being able to process new inputs, stuff it didn't see during training.
So if a network can understand Mary loves John, even though it never specifically learned that sentence?
Yeah, that's a basic form of systematicity.
But it's not super impressive, right? I mean, we do that all the time.
Right, so then you have strong systematicity. That's the next level up.
Strong systematicity.
That means the model can process sentences with elements in places they never appeared during training. So like if it never saw Mary as the subject,
Right.
but it can still understand Mary loves John, that's strong systematicity.
So it's not just about new sentences, it's about new grammatical roles, new structures.
Exactly. And then the strongest form, the holy grail of systematicity.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat.
It's called strong semantic systematicity.
Strong semantic systematicity.
This one, the model has to not only understand the grammar of a new sentence, but also the meaning.
Wow, so it can't just parse the words, it has to actually get what it's saying.
Yep, that's a tall order.
Sounds incredibly difficult.
It is, and while there's been some progress in getting connectionist models to show strong systematicity,
Okay.
that strong semantic systematicity, it's still a big challenge.
So the debate is still raging on then. Connectionists have made some progress explaining systematicity, but can they really fully explain the way human thought works, especially with complex meaning? It's still up for debate.
You got it. But even the debate itself, it's been productive.
How so?
It's forced both sides, the connectionists and the classicists, to really think about their assumptions, to refine their models. It's pushing the boundaries of our understanding of how the mind works.
It's clear that connectionism has really shaken things up in the philosophy of mind.
For sure.
And I'm really excited to see where it all goes. But for now, I think we need a little break.
Sounds good.
When we get back, we'll explore another philosophical issues from connectionism, one that's especially relevant for our philosophy fans out there. The question of semantic similarity. How do these networks represent meaning? And does it match up with how we intuitively understand the world? Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been exploring this wild world of connectionism, right?
We have, from how those neural networks work to all the philosophical questions they raise.
We've seen how they challenge those old school views of the mind.
And how they give us new ways to think about, like, representation, learning, even language.
Exactly. But there's this one more concept from our source material that I really want to get into.
Oh, yeah.
Especially for our philosophy buffs out there.
Lay it on me.
Semantic similarity.
Semantic similarity. Now, that's where things get really interesting, philosophically speaking.
Right. It's like connectionism offers this whole new perspective on how meaning might be represented in the brain. Totally different from that classical symbol-based view.
It is.
So remind me again, how do connectionist models think about meaning?
Basically, they say meaning is encoded in those patterns of activation across a network. Similar concepts, they'll have similar activation patterns.
Okay.
And the more similar those patterns are, the more semantically similar the concepts are.
So it's not about having a dedicated neuron for like cat or dog. It's the whole network lighting up in a specific way when you encounter those concepts.
Exactly. It's like a giant semantic space where concepts are grouped together based on their meaning. So cat is closer to dog in that space than it is to banana because their activation patterns have more overlap.
That's pretty intuitive. I mean, we talk about concepts being related or similar all the time.
We do, but of course, you know how philosophers are. There's got to be some wrinkles, right?
Always. So what kind of philosophical puzzles come up when you start thinking about meaning in terms of those distributed representations?
Well, one challenge is that everyone's brain is different, right?
Right, no two brains are wired exactly the same way.
So if meaning is all about those specific activation patterns, how can we even compare patterns across different brains?
That's a good point. Wouldn't that make it impossible to talk about, like, shared meanings, objective truth?
It's a tough one for sure. It keeps philosophers and cognitive scientists up at night, but there's been some cool research on coming up with ways to measure similarity, even taking brain differences into account. The idea is to focus on the overall relationships between concepts, not just the specific neurons.
So even if my cat neuron is in a different spot than yours, we can still compare our overall understanding of cat based on how it relates to other things in our networks.
Exactly. And there's some evidence that if you train networks on the same task, even if their structures are different, they'll end up with similar activation patterns for the same concepts.
Interesting.
It suggests that maybe there are some basic principles of like semantic organization that are shared across different brains, even if the physical wiring is different.
That's kind of reassuring.
Right. But there are other challenges too. Another big one is what's sometimes called the collateral information problem.
Collateral information problem.
It basically means our knowledge about a concept, it comes from our own experiences. My concept of cat is going to be different from yours because I've interacted with cats differently throughout my life.
So my cat activation pattern might include, like, my childhood pet or Garfield comics or that time I got scratched by a stray cat. Yours could be completely different.
Exactly. All those experiences, they get woven into our activation patterns. So even if we both have strong activation for cat, the details of those patterns are going to be unique, reflecting our own individual knowledge.
So it's not just about having a similar shape in that semantic space. It's about having all the same little details, the associations. Seems like a pretty high bar for two brains to clear.
It is a high bar, and it raises the question of whether just similarity is enough to capture the full richness of meaning.
Right. There's got to be more to it than just overlapping patterns.
There is. There's a whole web of personal experiences, cultural influences, even emotional stuff that contributes to how we understand things.
That makes me think about Wittgenstein. His ideas about language games.
Oh, yeah.
He said the meaning of a word, it's not fixed. It depends on how it's used in different contexts, different games. It seems like connectionist semantics might actually fit with that view.
I see what you mean. Meaning isn't just about static representations, it's about how those representations are actually used in different situations.
Dynamic.
Exactly. And connectionism, it kind of pushes us in that direction, away from those simple ideas of meaning as fixed symbols and towards something more dynamic, more context sensitive.
So is connectionism the answer to everything? Maybe not, but it's definitely giving us some exciting new ways to think about how meaning works, how it's grounded in our brains and our experiences.
It is, and it sparked these incredible conversations between philosophers, cognitive scientists, and computer scientists. It makes this field so vibrant, so intellectually stimulating.
Well, I'm definitely feeling stimulated, maybe even a little overloaded.
It's a lot to take in.
We've covered so much ground today, I need some time to process it all.
Me too.
But before we go, I want to thank you again for taking us on this deep dive into connectionism. It's been a wild ride.
My pleasure. Connectionism is full of surprises. I always enjoy talking about it with curious people.
And to all our listeners out there, especially our philosopher friends, we hope this deep dive is giving you some new ideas to chew on.
Keep those synapses firing, folks.
Keep exploring, and as always, we welcome your thoughts, your questions, your feedback. Until next time, deep divers, keep on diving.